Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, I want to quickly run through with you the intrinsic muscles of the thorax. Bear in mind that if you take muscles of the thorax, you have the intrinsic muscles and the extrinsic muscles. Now, for the extrinsic muscles, what happens is that they have one of their attachment to the thorax and then one outside, the wall or the thoracic cage, and that's why we call them extrinsic muscles. Later on, we get to know that they will be very important accessory muscles for inspiration. Okay, when we look at them. But for today, we are looking at the intrinsic muscles of the thorax. Now, these intrinsic muscles tells you that they will have both origin and insertion, okay, by way of attachment in the thorax itself. So without much ado, let's quickly go through this. So there we are. I was telling you about the extrinsic muscle, like sternocleidomastoid. We will see all those one: levator, scalenus, group of muscles, scalenus anterior, yes, medius, and of course posterior muscle. If you see them, pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, you see all those ones, the serratus anterior and the rest. But today we are interested in the intrinsic group of muscles. Now, for the intrinsic group of muscles from external to internal, okay, as we move, that's how we are going to go it. The first one is the external intercostal muscle. External intercostal muscle. Now, the truth is that the external intercostal muscle is a continuation of the external oblique muscle, which was in the abdomen. So if you remember, external oblique, okay, was the most external trilaminar muscle in the abdomen. Now, when you get to the thoracic region, the intrinsic muscle over there, okay, which is the most externally placed one, is what we call the external intercostal muscle. Now, the key thing, if you remember, in the abdomen, where we looked at the anterior abdominal wall, the external oblique muscle ran inferomedially. So the fibers run inferomedially. Okay, that's one key thing. So the point here is that there's a rib is costal bone, so there's another rib, costal bone. Therefore, in between any two ribs will be an intercostal space, and these intercostal spaces will be filled by these intercostal muscle that we are going to look at, or these intrinsic muscles we are going to look at. So the first one, which is the most external one, is the external intercostal muscle. External intercostal muscle. Okay, now the point here is that this external intercostal muscle projecting posteriorly, and as it comes anteriorly through its inferomedial course, at the level of the at the level of the costochondral joint, okay, over here, costochondral joint, then what happens is that it changes to become what we call membranous. Therefore, what happens is that during dissections, when you dissect this area, you may see that in the level of, so parasternally, okay, or beyond what we have the what we call the costochondral joint, what will happen is that you do not see the fleshy muscles, but you see some kind of whitish membranous substance here, and deep to it you see the deeper muscle, which will not be external intercostal, because beyond the costochondral joint, the external intercostal muscle fails to become fleshy again, but rather becomes membranous. So just like if you remember in the case of the abdominal wall, when we saw the external oblique muscle being fleshy externally, but as it laterally, but as it came anteriorly around the mid clavicular joint, it became aponeurotic. It's the same phenomenon which is taking place here. Similar phenomenon actually. So that's what we see. Now, this external intercostal muscle, originates from the lower aspect of a rib. So, for instance, if it's this rib or this rib, its lower aspect, that's where it's going to originate from. And then it will go inferomedially to insert on what we call the superior, okay, aspect or upper border of what we call a rib below it. So that's how they will run. That's the external intercostal muscles. So it tells you that because we are going to have 11 intercostal spaces. Why? Because we are going to have 12 ribs. Below rib 12, there's no any other rib. Therefore, that becomes a subcostal space. Okay, so that's that one. There's no intercostal muscle coming there. So there will be 11 pair of these. External intercostal muscles actually. Now these ribs, external intercostal muscles are very important. Okay, as far as inspiration is concerned. So that I can help move the ribs, outwards and then upwards, okay, to increase the interthoracic, volume, and for that matter reduce interthoracic pressure, okay, for air to come in. into the lungs. As a result, because it is going to be 11 of these ones, then of course they will be supplied by the corresponding intercostal nerves. So intercostal nerves related to the T1 all the way to T11. Okay, so that's what we have. Now the key thing over here is that if I cut, okay, this muscle, if I cut and reflect it, I'll get the next muscle beneath it. Okay, or in the membranous part, if I remove the membrane, the next muscle I will see will be the inner one to this one, and that inner muscle is what we call the internal intercostal muscle. Okay, so if this is the external intercostal muscle, if I cut and reflect it deep to it, I will have what we call the internal intercostal muscle. Now again, internal intercostal muscle will be fleshy, okay, right from the anterior aspect where we have the sternum all the way, but as you go beyond the angle of the rib, then it also becomes membranous, so that we see the internal intercostal membrane. So remember, as they get to the posterior aspect beyond the angle, it becomes membranous. But for external intercostal muscle, as you go to what we call the costochondral joints, beyond the costochondral joint, they become what we call membranous. So get to know these distinctions. So just like the external intercostal muscle, they also be 11 and therefore be supplied by the corresponding intercostal nerves. Now the key thing over here is that it will originate, okay, from the lateral edge of the costal groove. Now you see, this area is where we have the costal groove. The inner edge will be by another deep muscle which we call the innermost. We will come to that one. So the lateral edge of what we call the costal groove, okay, will be filled, or the lateral lip of the costal groove will be filled by, or will take attachment, will be the origin for what we call the internal intercostal muscle. Then of course it will insert on the superior margin, okay, of a rib below, okay, below it. Okay, so that's what we are going to see. Now this muscle is usually, as far as inspiratory movement is concerned, then usually when there's forced or deep breathing, that is when it's usually utilized. But of course it is going to be antagonist by way of action to what we call the external intercostal muscle. So for instance, in inspiratory movements, yes, while external intercostal muscle is causing what we call the rib cage to move, while that one is contracting, internal intercostal muscle will be relaxing, okay, and then they ensuring that the volume of the thoracic cage actually increases. So they are antagonists actually. So that is what we are going to see. Now the key thing over here is that we will get to know that it will have a similar organization as another one which you have here, which you call it the innermost intercostal muscle. So this is what I want to show you. Now this is the external intercostal muscle. You can see how the fibers are running. They are running inframedially. Now the internal intercostal muscle, its fibers are running inferolaterally or superomedially, so whichever way you want to say it. But with respect to origin and insertion, then we say inferolaterally. So they run perpendicular to the fibers of the external intercostal muscle. So that's what you see. Now you can see that if I cut and reflect this one deep to it, we have another muscle which you call it the innermost intercostal muscle. Now this innermost intercostal muscle is one of the innermost group of muscles that we have. So we see other innermost ones, but with respect to these intercostal muscles, then of course we are going to have the external, internal, and innermost. Now just like we saw in the case of the abdomen, where in between the second and third layers there was a neurovascular plane, okay, this area, neurovascular plane. The same way for the the thorax as well. Therefore, in between the second muscle layer, where is the internal intercostal, and the third muscle layer, where is the innermost intercostal, there will be a neurovascular plane. Neurovascular plane in the sense that there will be neurovascular bundle, which includes these nerve and vessels, and these nerves they will run actually in the costal groove. So this is the costal groove, okay, moving. We are having what we call the intercostal vein, intercostal artery, and intercostal nerve. Using the mnemonic van can help you remember these ones from superior to inferior. Well, of course, you may have that kind of collateral, vessel and neurovascular structures as well. But the key thing is that they will all be present in the neurovascular plane. Now, this innermost intercostal, now the point is that the fibers are running in the same fashion as internal intercostal muscle. And that's where, you know, it becomes a bit difficult for you to separate them. So the only separation that you can use will be the the neurovascular plane and its bundle can help you to differentiate them. Okay, so that is what we have to know. So one key thing is that this innermost intercostal muscle will be deep. The first point is that if I cut and reflect this internal intercostal, then deep to it, I'm going to have these ones. The fibers again are run in the same fashion as, you know, innermost internal intercostal, which tells us that the fibers will be running, you know, infero medially, or superomedially or inferolaterally. So as they go this way, inferolaterally. Okay, so that's one thing. So it means that now we said that the outer lip of this costal groove was the origin for the internal. So the inner lip for this costal groove will be the origin for the, you know, innermost intercostal muscle. And then of course it will come in and insert, you know, in the superior margin of, you know, the rib below. Okay, the rib below. So that's what we see. So the key thing over here is that all these muscles are originating from a rib above, coming to insert on a rib below. So that's what you have to know about these ones. And then one key thing is that with this muscle, yes, it will support the internal intercostal muscle, especially during deep breathing. Okay, in that regard. So we see those ones. In summary, I'll give you the functions of all these muscles. Now, the next muscle, which we also classify it as the innermost group of muscles, will be what we call the transversus thoracic muscle. Or we also say that the innermost group of these muscles are referred to as what we call the transversus thoracic group of muscles. And these muscles, yes, we've seen one of them already, which is the innermost intercostal muscle. We also see another one we call the stenocostalis muscle, which otherwise is actually the transversus thoracic muscle proper, these muscles that we find over here. And we also see another one which we call the subcostalis muscle. So actually this we can also call the stenocostalis muscle, or specifically the transversus thoracic muscle. So look at how those fibers are. So it means that it's going to originate from the internal surface, an innermost group of muscle type, from the lower part of what we call the internal surface of the body of the sternum. Okay, so the mandible will be here, but actually the lower part of the body of the sternum. Okay, that's where it's going to originate from, as well as of course the xiphoid process. Okay, and then it of course move upwards, okay, or superlaterally to actually insert on the inner surface of what we call the second to sixth costal cartilages, this area. So that's what we call the transversus thoracic group of muscles. Now this muscle is actually supplied because it's going to insert to what we call the costal cartilages of, you know, ribs 2 to 6. Then what will happen is that it will be innervated by, of course, you know, the intercostal nerves T2, to that of T6 vertebral levels, and then functionally it will be a weak depressor of the rib, So that's what we are going to see. Now the other muscle, which we also call it, the transversus thoracic group of muscles, or the innermost group of muscles, this time around finding itself in the, you know, the paravertebral gutters, which means that you can only see it posteriorly. You can't see it at the anterior aspect. You can only see it posteriorly. And one unique thing about this subcostalis muscle is that yes, although it is originating from the inner surface of a rib, okay, so let's say the inner surface of a rib, okay, and then its fibers are moving in the same fashion as what we call internal intercostal muscle, because at the end of the day, just like the innermost, they will all be running in a similar fashion. So it is running in the same fashion as what we call internal intercostal muscle, which means that the fibers will be running, you know, superolaterally. So look at how the fibers are running. The fibers are running superolaterally, actually. So what will happen is that these fibers, they run downwards, okay, crossing more than one intercostal space. So that's the key thing. Now if it is moving from here, okay, instead of coming to, so from this rib, instead of coming and inserting to the rib just below it, it goes beyond that. So you can go beyond 2 intercostal spaces. So there will be a space here. Instead of inserting here, it didn't. Maybe instead of inserting here, it didn't, or maybe came to insert here. So you may insert 2 or 3, it will cross more than 1 intercostal space, actually 2 or 3 intercostal space. In other words, it will insert on an inferior rib, superior aspect of an inferior rib, 2 or 3, okay, inferior aspect of below that kind of rib which it originated from. So from this rib, okay, it went about 3 ribs below it, and then from this rib it went about 1 rib below it. So it's crossing that kind of 2 intercostal space or 3 intercostal space. That's the key thing over here. So that one too is going to support the sternocostal muscle, that transversus thoracic muscle, okay, especially during that kind of movement in the rib. Okay, so that is what we have for the subcostalis muscle. So actually from the inferior aspect of a rib above goes 2 or 3 intercostal spaces to insert on an inferior rib. Now by way of summary, what we have to know is that yes, the external intercostal muscle, yes, will originate from the inferior margin of a rib above, okay, and then attach on the superior surface of a rib below. Okay, that is the what we call the external intercostal muscle. And then to be relevant during inspiration, it's also going to support the intercostal space and to help move the rib superiorly and of course outwards. The next one is deep to it, be the internal intercostal muscle from lateral edge of the costal groove of rib above. Yes, that's what we said. So that from medial edge of the costal groove, above, that one will be for the innermost, because when I cut and reflect the internal intercostal, I'll get the innermost. And then what will happen is that yes, it will insert on the superior surface of a rib below, and of course that will be deep to the external intercostal, no problem. And then that one will also be the same for the internal intercostal. But one key thing is that the internal intercostal during forced breathing, then it will be relevant, especially for exhalation. Okay, and so very important in supporting the intercostal space, no problem, because of course in between the internal intercostal and innermost intercostal, we are going to have the neurovascular bundle being present. So as I said, innermost intercostal will be synergistic to that of the internal intercostal muscle. And then we also have the subcostalis muscle. Okay, so the subcostalis muscle, now that one will originate from the internal surface near the angle of, so that's why we said that one will be in the paravertebral gutter. So it will be near actually the angle. That's the key point, near the angle. Okay, that will be the the inferior surface of a superior rib, and then to insert at the lower aspect of another rib 2 or 3 below it. So they will cross more than 1 intercostal space. That's the key, more than 1 intercostal space, and to be helpful in depressing the rib. Then you also have what you call the transversus thoracic muscle, which you also call the sternocostal muscle. Now it originates from the lower margin of the internal surface of the the costal cartilages, as well as of course the lower aspect of the its origin will actually be from what you call the inferior aspect of the body of the sternum, as well as xiphoid process. Okay, and then of course it will move upwards to insert in what we call the 2nd to 6th costal cartilages, and it will be important in depressing what we call the rib. So that is that for you. I hope you find it helpful as far as studying the intrinsic muscles of the thorax. Have a good night.